The hum of the plane was muffled luxury thick carpeting beneath Italian leather seats, the low clink of glasses being filled with champagne, the kind of silence money bought at 30,000 feet. Ethan Walker barely noticed. Seated near the front of Flight 287 bound for St. Lucia, he was already absorbed in his tablet, flicking through architectural renderings and development maps, unaware that his life so precise, so engineered, was about to detour into something neither logic nor strategy could have predicted. Outside the window, the sky was soft with twilight. The tech tycoon wore tailored navy slacks loafers, without a scuff a watch that ticked with the quiet smugness of Swiss precision. But behind the polish there was a man used to planning, not feeling. He had built green cities in deserts and vertical farms on forgotten rooftops, yet inside he hadn't built much at all. A decade of boardrooms and hotel suites had numbed him to anything real, until she stepped on the plane. Correction, until her son screamed. From the economy section came a shrill, piercing wail, raw, innocent, and unrelenting. It cut through the air like lightning, jolting the first-class passengers from their tranquil bubble. Ethan looked up, mildly annoyed at first. He saw flight attendants exchanging strained glances, heard the murmurs. "Can't she shut that kid up?" someone muttered. "This is going to be a long flight." Another passenger sighed louder. Ethan narrowed his eyes toward the source of the sound. Something pulling at him, not the cry itself, but the voice that came after. "Shh, baby, please." A woman whispered, her voice cracked with exhaustion and kindness. "Mama's here. Just hold on, Zion." Zion. The name alone felt biblical, but it was the voice that made Ethan go still. He stood before he could explain why. His legs moved on their own, cutting through the plush aisle, nodding politely as the flight attendant tried to intercept him. "Sir, first class is this way." "What's going on back there?" he asked, eyes fixed forward. "A woman and her baby," she answered with professional irritation. "We're looking into rebooking her. She's clearly overwhelmed." "I'll handle it," he said without explanation. When he reached the chaos of row 34B, he saw her, and time folded in on itself. There she was, Naomi Brooks. Hair swept back into a messy bun, dark skin glowing with sweat and stress, her curves hidden beneath a simple black travel dress. Her toddler was wailing in her lap, kicking red-faced and inconsolable, and Naomi, who had once danced barefoot on a college rooftop with him under starlight, was crying silently. Their eyes met. And the plane, the people, the years, it all evaporated. He whispered her name, not daring to believe it. "Naomi." Her head jerked up. "Ethan," she breathed like she'd seen a ghost. The baby cried harder, but the past cried louder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 11 years collapsed into a single breath. Then, without asking, Ethan knelt beside her and gently reached out. "Hey, little guy," he said softly to the child, "you having a rough day?" And just like that, Zion quieted. The transformation was instant and inexplicable. The toddler's hiccups faded into wide-eyed curiosity. His tiny hand reached for Ethan's fingers, and the grip that followed was pure trust. Naomi stared. He doesn't usually do that with strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Ethan said quietly, though he barely understood what he meant. He stood and turned to the stunned attendant now lingering nearby. "I'd like to switch seats with this lady, immediately." "Sir, you're in first class. That's a significant fare difference." "I'll pay it," Ethan said, still watching Naomi. "Whatever it is, please." Naomi's lips parted. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." There was a tone in his voice she remembered. Not arrogance, conviction. The same tone he once used when he told her he wanted to build a world where green cities didn't mean concrete and glass, but people and roots. 20 minutes later, Naomi sat in seat 1A first class, holding a now quiet Zion. She looked unsure of everything, except that Ethan was sitting beside her. "You look—" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right word. "Tired," she offered, wry smile flickering. "No, you look brave." She looked down, eyelashes trembling. "Bravery isn't a choice when you have a baby." There was a pause. So she asked almost too casually, "What's a man like you doing back in the Caribbean?" "I was supposed to give a keynote at the Tech and Sustainability Summit in St. Lucia. Supposed to, I think I just found something more important." Zion stirred and reached toward Ethan again. And Naomi, who had lost a husband to cancer and herself to time, began to wonder, was this coincidence or the kind of divine twist life rarely gives you twice? Outside, the sky darkened into indigo. Inside, a light kindled between two people who hadn't spoken in over a decade, and one small soul who didn't care about the past, only that someone kind had finally held his hand. Love doesn't always knock on the door. Sometimes it sits beside you on an airplane, smiles gently, and offers to carry your baggage, both literal and otherwise. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a comment, and follow the channel. There's more to come. This is only the beginning of something that might just change everything. Hami, Winnie. It had been 11 years since Naomi last saw Ethan Walker. 11 years since the boy with sea glass eyes and impossible dreams had whispered promises against her skin in a college dorm room. Since he'd sketched their future on napkins and kissed her between caffeine-fueled exam sessions, like she was the only thing worth remembering in a world full of ambition. Now seated across from him in first class, cradling her sleeping son in her arms, Naomi felt like her breath had been stolen by a memory made real. Ethan hadn't changed, and yet he had. Gone was the lanky idealist who lived on takeout noodles and boundless fire. The man before her now had the calm elegance of someone who had tasted the world and chosen which parts to keep. His jaw was more defined, his hands calloused in a way that only people who build things understand. His voice carried gravity, not arrogance. But his eyes, those startling green eyes, were unchanged. And when they landed on her, it felt like the missing years folded in on themselves. Zion, Ethan said softly, nodding toward the baby nestled against her shoulder. She nodded. My son. He just turned 2. There was a pause. Naomi didn't offer more than that. Let him do the math. And he did. Ethan's breath caught for a second, and then he smiled, a quiet, almost reverent thing. He's beautiful, he murmured. Naomi traced her thumb over Zion's soft curls. He's everything. I can tell, Ethan said, still watching them, his gaze gentle. He has your smile. Her lips quirked. He has my stubbornness, too, and my sleep schedule, unfortunately. They both laughed low and uncertain, like they were learning a language long forgotten. Then came silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but thick with unspoken history. It wrapped around them like a blanket stitched from memory and regret. Do you remember the first time we met? Ethan asked, finally, his voice dipping into nostalgia. Naomi looked at him, startled. You mean when you stole my seat in the university library? I didn't steal it. It had my initials carved into the table. She laughed, really laughed this time. It surprised them both. EW plus, she began. I was waiting to finish the rest, he said. But you scared me off. You mean I intimidated you? Exactly. Their smiles faded into something softer. Naomi rested her cheek against Zion's head, inhaling his baby skin scent, mixed with the faint sweetness of mango snacks. Ethan was still watching her, not like someone who wanted answers, but like someone who wasn't sure he deserved them. She broke the silence first. You left, no warning, just gone. He didn't flinch. I know. You could have written, called. I checked my email for months. I know, he repeated quieter. Why? Her voice cracked, not with anger, but something heavier. A question not just from her mouth, but from the girl she used to be, the one who had said yes to a future and then had it ripped from her palms. Ethan looked away then, out the window into the growing dusk. His reflection shimmered faintly on the glass, fractured by light. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said after a moment. I had this offer, the kind that changes your life. Big names, big money. It was everything I had worked for. And my father, he said, if I stayed with you, I'd ruin it all. That we were too young. That I was throwing my future away for a dream. Naomi's fingers tightened protectively around Zion. So you threw me away instead. He winced. Not dramatically, just a small twitch of the eye, a narrowing of the mouth. But she saw it. I was 21 and stupid and scared, he admitted. And worse, I believed them. Naomi closed her eyes. She had dreamed of this conversation for years, composing speeches in the shower, in traffic, in those quiet moments between sobs and silence. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like holding a broken shell, and realizing the ocean inside it had already slipped away. "Did you ever look for me?" she whispered. Ethan hesitated. "I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I figured, you deserve better than a man who abandoned you for ambition." She opened her mouth, but Zion stirred his small hand pressing against her chest. Naomi paused. She kissed his forehead, held him tighter. The rhythm of his breath steadied her own. "My husband died 8 months ago," she said, eyes fixed ahead. "Marcus. He was kind, steady. He loved Zion. He loved me." "I'm so sorry," Ethan said, and she believed him. She nodded. "He was safe. I didn't burn with him the way I burned with you, but he helped me heal." There it was. The truth between them laid bare like soft linen in sun. Ethan swallowed hard. And Zion, adopted. He was 3 months old when we got him. His birth mother couldn't keep him. I held him once, and I just knew. Ethan smiled at that. "He's lucky to have you." Naomi turned her head. Their eyes met again. And in that gaze, something stirred. Recognition, regret, reverence. She saw the boy who once danced barefoot on the roof with her, who built imaginary futures with cardboard and conviction. But she also saw a man who had learned how much silence could cost, how ambition without love was just another form of emptiness. And Ethan, he saw the girl who had once trusted him with her whole heart, and the woman who had become fire and grace and tenderness in the wake of unimaginable loss. Neither said it aloud, but the truth was as loud as the engine humming beneath them. They still mattered to each other, even after all this time. Zion shifted in Naomi's lap, and she brushed his hair with motherly instinct. Ethan watched the movement like it was sacred. And somewhere in the cabin, lit by quiet overhead lamps and 1,000 heartbeats of silence, a possibility began to take root again. Something Ethan hadn't felt in years. Hope. A hope shaped like forgiveness. A hope that smelled like mango on toddler fingers. A hope that wore old memories and new beginnings all at once. The plane flew on, steady and sure-cutting across the night sky. And inside, two people sat side by side, neither quite sure what tomorrow held, but both quietly, dangerously starting to wonder. What if love didn't end? What if it had just waited? The wheels of the plane touched the St. Lucian runway with a soft final sigh, as if even the aircraft understood the weight of what it carried. Naomi gathered her things with practiced efficiency. One hand cradled Zion, the other adjusted his small bag, and the worn blanket he never slept without. Her body moved, but her heart lingered in first class, where Ethan's presence still echoed like an unfinished song. They had spoken little after their conversation, falling into a quiet that wasn't avoidance, but the kind of silence that holds two people in parallel thought. Ethan hadn't pressed. He seemed to sense that the past couldn't be undone in one flight, that grief and love were layered things, and some truths needed time to breathe. But Naomi knew. Even as she stepped into the humid island air and inhaled the scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming ylang-ylang, she knew what memory would greet her first. It wasn't Marcus, though he had loved her deeply. It was Ethan barefoot, laughing, balancing a takeout box on one hand and architectural sketches in the other, leading her up the fire escape of their college dorm to that rooftop that had become theirs. "Trust me," he'd said, eyes gleaming with moonlight and mischief. "You have to see this." They were 19, broke, sleep-deprived, reckless in that way only love allows. She remembered the way he had laid out his project, a model of an eco-community made of toothpicks and recycled cardboard, and explained his dream with the urgency of someone who believed imagination was currency. "I want to build places where people can live and breathe," at the same time he had said. Not just survive, Naomi, thrive. And she had believed in him. Because how could she not? He saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be. She had kissed him that night. Not because it was romantic, though it was, but because it was inevitable. They had fallen into each other the way spring leans into summer, slow, seamless, and utterly impossible to resist. It started with study sessions. Naomi had staked out the same table in the library for weeks, a fortress of anatomy textbooks and highlighters, her curls tied back and her headphones in. Ethan wandered in one afternoon, flustered and half late for a studio review, and dropped into the seat across from her. You're in my spot, she said, not looking up. I don't see your name on it. She raised an eyebrow. Look again. He did. Carved faintly into the wood were initials NB. He grinned. Well, now I feel like I've sat in royalty's throne. She rolled her eyes. You're obnoxious. He extended a hand. Ethan Walker. Terrible at boundaries. Worse at organic chemistry. Something about his smile made her lower her guard. They studied together that night. And then the next, and then the next after that. Coffee runs became walks across campus. Group chats became inside jokes. She started to look for his texts in the morning. He memorized how she liked her tea. She introduced him to her grandmother, Aunt Essie, over video call. He introduced her to the world of sustainable tech, carrying a sketchbook full of dreams. They were fire and ocean, sometimes clashing, always dancing. She believed in community medicine. He believed in green economies. They talked of building a clinic with solar panels and vertical gardens. She would heal. He would house. Together, they would remake a corner of the world. They were young. They were unstoppable. Until they weren't. The day his father flew in changed everything. Naomi remembered it too clearly, the dinner at the fancy restaurant, her nervous fingers smoothing her skirt the way Ethan's father never truly looked at her. He had smiled, yes, but it was a smile sharpened with judgment. You're very bright, he had said, folding his napkin. And it's admirable, the whole community service thing. But Ethan's future requires mobility, agility, the kind of freedom marriage rarely allows. Ethan had reached for her hand under the table, but she felt it, then the tremble, the uncertainty, the way his grip wasn't as firm as it had been before. Days later, the offers came. Fellowships, startups, a coveted position under a billionaire venture capitalist who wanted to reimagine global cities. She cheered for him. Of course she did, because that's what you do when you love someone, you cheer, even when your voice is cracking. I'll find a job near wherever you go, she had told him. But he had hesitated. Then the silence started. Long pauses, missed texts, conversations that ended too quickly. She asked him one night just 3 weeks before graduation, her voice quiet but edged with steel. Are you leaving? He had nodded. I got an offer I can't turn down. Berlin, then Tokyo, then back to the valley. I get it, she interrupted. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Naomi, don't, she whispered. Please don't make it worse with words you don't mean. He looked at her like she was the sun, and he'd forgotten his skin could burn. I love you, he said, but it wasn't enough. Because love isn't always louder than fear. Now sitting in the taxi from the airport, Zion curled against her chest, and the island unfurling like a memory around her, Naomi blinked back tears. She hadn't cried when he left. She hadn't even cried when she saw his name in the magazines tied to cities and breakthroughs and fortunes. But here now, after a single plane ride that felt like destiny had come calling, she was unraveling. Zion stirred his small fingers, clutching the pendant around her neck. I've got you, she whispered, kissing his head. But as the taxi wound past sugarcane fields and coral-colored houses, Naomi wasn't sure if she was saying it to her son or herself, because something had shifted. And no matter how much she clung to the life she'd built, the one she'd fought tooth and nail for, one truth was now pulsing beneath her skin. Ethan was back. And nothing, not even the weight of the past, would make her heart forget what they never got to say. Siwon. Naomi's childhood home stood at the end of a red dirt path that curled between wild hibiscus bushes and mango trees heavy with fruit. Perched on a hillside overlooking the eastern bay of St. Lucia, the house had once been white now. It was weather-worn and speckled with patches of moss and sun-faded memories. The shutters creaked when the sea wind passed through, and the veranda had lost 2 slats, revealing the rusting underbones of a home long carried by love and time, not wealth. But to Naomi it was sacred. It was here her grandmother, Aunt Essie, had raised her with firm hands and soft prayers. Here she had first wrapped her small fingers around a stethoscope and declared she would heal the world. And it was here she returned after Marcus died, seeking shelter in the place that had always received her, with arms wide open, even when her heart was barely holding together. Zion cooed on her hip as she opened the gate. The scent of cinnamon bark and damp earth greeted them first. Then came Aunt Essie's voice, rich as molasses and sharp as ginger. About time you got here, girl. Baby needs a real nap, and you need sleep that ain't borrowed. Naomi smiled despite her weariness. We made it, didn't we? Aunt Essie stood barefoot on the porch, wrapped in a floral muumuu, gray hair wrapped in a turban like a crown. Her gaze slid past Naomi and landed on Zion, who reached toward her, with the instinct of someone who'd already claimed her as kin. Well, hello, sweetness, Essie cooed, taking the baby and kissing his forehead. You come home to your roots, huh? As Naomi stepped into the shade of the veranda, she felt something loosen inside her. Here there were no headlines, no demands, no impossible expectations, just ocean, earth, and breath. She slept for nearly 14 hours that night. 3 days later, Ethan appeared at the gate. Naomi heard the knock while she was peeling breadfruit in the kitchen. Her fingers stilled, her heart leapt, and before she even turned, she knew. She stepped onto the veranda, blinking at the brightness. There he stood, dressed in jeans and a light button-down, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, and eyes that scanned her like they were starving. I brought tools, he said simply. Naomi crossed her arms. Tools? To fix the veranda. And that leaking roof. I noticed the wood's warped. I figure you've got better things to spend money on than hiring someone. You flew across the world and now you want to play handyman. I didn't fly across the world just to play anything, Naomi. His voice was gentle, but there was a thread of earnestness she recognized, like the boy who once believed a cardboard model could change city planning. The boy who had once convinced her to dream beside him. I can pay you, she said dryly. I don't want payment, he replied. I just want to help. Naomi hesitated. Then Aunt Essie appeared behind her, arms folded. If the boy wants to work, let him. Lord knows we could use an extra back around here. Just don't let him near my ginger plants. Last man who did ruined an entire harvest. With that, she pushed past Naomi and opened the gate. You know where the shed is, Mr. Walker. Ethan smiled at her like she'd just handed him a golden key. Yes, ma'am. Naomi watched him disappear around the back, heat rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. Over the following days, Ethan became a fixture on the property. He repaired the loose boards on the porch. He patched the roof during a sudden rainstorm, drenched and laughing like he had never left. He fetched water when the pressure dropped, hauled groceries from the town market, and learned how to coax fresh coconut milk with the back of a machete. But it wasn't his sweat that unraveled Naomi's resolve. It was the way he held Zion. No hesitation, no performance, just real honest tenderness. He spoke to the boy like he mattered. Let him ride on his shoulders, sang to him off-key, let him fall asleep on his chest while reading old children's books Naomi hadn't touched in years. Once late at night, Naomi stepped onto the veranda and found them there. Zion nestled against Ethan, both fast asleep beneath the humming ceiling fan. Ethan's head tilted back, lips parted just slightly, as though, even in rest, he was holding space for someone else. She watched them for a long time, and something within her ached with the simplicity of the scene. The kind of ache that didn't hurt but whispered, this is what could have been. One evening, Naomi was in the garden when Ethan approached. I finished the window frame, he said, wiping his hands on a towel. The one with the view of the sea. She nodded. Thank you. He hesitated, then sat on the edge of the garden bed. The sun behind him cast his silhouette in gold. Do you believe in second chances, he asked. Naomi dug her fingers into the soil, turning it slowly. I believe in growth, which means sometimes, yes. I made a mess of things before. Yes, she said softly, you did. But I didn't stop loving you. The words came out low, unsteady. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was simply telling the truth. Naomi looked at him. The man who had once left her for the world, who had returned not with apologies but with action, who now planted himself beside her like he wasn't afraid to get dirty, literally or otherwise. Love without presence is just a ghost, she whispered. Ethan nodded. Then let me stay. Not to haunt you, but to learn how to be here. Her heart beat loud in her chest. I'm not the girl I was, she warned. I don't want her, he said. I want the woman who came back home. The one who carried a baby through grief, who rebuilt herself from splinters. I see you, Naomi. She swallowed. I'm not asking for your heart today, he added. Just the chance to earn tomorrow. Naomi blinked, feeling the earth beneath her nails, the air thick with the scent of bougainvillea, and her son laughing with Aunt Essie inside the house. Here on this island of beginnings and endings, something within her cracked open not to break, but to let light in. Maybe tomorrow wasn't so far away. The sky had been teasing rain all day. Clouds heavy with moisture dragged across the St. Lucian hills like bruised silk. The scent of petrichor lingered in the air, wet leaves, ripe soil, and distant thunder threading through the island breeze. Naomi stood on the veranda, rocking Zion in her arms, watching the first drops paint circles on the stone path below. Inside, Aunt Essie was already lighting candles, her voice humming an old hymn that seemed older than the house itself. The power flickered, then surrendered altogether with a sigh of surrender. Nightfall arrived, cloaked in storm clouds, and soon wind began to moan through the shutters, like some long-lost spirit returning home. And still Ethan hadn't come back from the market. Naomi tried not to look at the clock again. It wasn't her place to worry. He was a grown man. He knew the roads. He'd left with a list and a quiet smile, promising to bring back sweet potatoes and mangoes. She told herself she wasn't concerned, just annoyed, just frustrated that someone who stirred her so deeply could also stir this kind of stillness within her. Zion stirred against her shoulder. His warm cheek nuzzled into her collarbone. Then came the sound of feet squelching through mud and the creak of the garden gate. Naomi stepped into the open doorway just as Ethan appeared. Rainwater dripping from his hair shirt soaked one reusable bag slung over his shoulder like a trophy. "I got the mangoes," he said, grinning breathless. She raised an eyebrow. "You nearly got swept into the bay for mangoes. They were your favorites, Julie mangoes, I remember." Naomi stared at him, half exasperated, half something else entirely. "Come inside before you drown." He obeyed, dripping water onto the wooden floor as he peeled off his wet shirt. Naomi tried not to look, but her eyes betrayed her. The man had always been lean, but now he carried strength beneath his skin. The kind of strength built from work and weight, not gym mirrors. He caught her glance and didn't smirk, didn't tease. He just looked back, soft, unguarded. The kind of look that asked her, "You still mine somewhere?" Naomi handed Zion to Aunt Essie, who took the child with a knowing look and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving a silence in her wake that hummed louder than thunder. In the candlelit kitchen, Ethan toweled off and moved toward the old record player. He found the same Marvin Gaye vinyl Naomi used to play on Sunday mornings in college. She hadn't touched it in years, but somehow it was still here, tucked behind her cookbooks like a secret waiting to be remembered. Soft music filled the space. Naomi turned to find him standing beside the stove, barefoot, drying the mangoes on a towel. "You remember too much," she said, half smiling. "I forget a lot of things," Ethan replied. "But not you." She closed her eyes briefly as if bracing herself. He moved closer. "I think about that rooftop sometimes," he said quietly. "The first time you kissed me, you had just argued with your anatomy professor. You were furious and brilliant, and I knew right then I'd never meet anyone like you again." "You didn't," she said, voice cooler than she felt. "Because you left." The words landed like rain on stone, soft but undeniable. He nodded. "I've replayed that moment more times than I care to admit." Naomi didn't respond. She walked to the counter, peeled a mango, her fingers steady even though her heart was not. The golden flesh clung stubbornly to the seed like memories refusing to let go. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," Ethan said. "I left because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of being ordinary. Of building something too soon. My father convinced me I needed to be more before I could be yours." She turned slowly. "But you were already enough for me." He exhaled like someone finally hearing the words that had eluded him for a lifetime. "I know that now," he said. "But back then, I thought love was something I had to earn after I conquered the world. I didn't realize that love was the world." Lightning flashed outside. The room lit up in a wash of pale blue, then dimmed again. Naomi placed the mango slices on a plate. Her hands trembled slightly. "You broke me," she whispered. "Not all at once, but like a tree losing bark. Bit by bit. I stopped dancing. I stopped singing in the shower. I stopped trusting my instincts." Ethan walked over and stood just behind her, not touching, but close enough for her to feel the warmth of him. "I want to help you heal," he said. "Not with promises, not with big gestures, but with presence." with truth. She turned to face him, their eyes inches apart. And if I don't want to be healed, then I'll stand beside you anyway, he said. Not to fix you, just to hold the pieces. It was too much, and not enough. She stepped back. You're saying all the right things, Naomi murmured. But life doesn't wait for the right words. Marcus didn't get a second chance. Zion doesn't get to understand why his dad is just a photo. And her voice cracked. I don't know if I have space to bleed all over again. Ethan's voice dropped. I'm not asking you to bleed. I'm asking for a chance to be part of the healing. Naomi looked at him and saw not the man who had left, but the one who had returned. Wet from a storm, empty-handed except for mangoes and remorse, and in his eyes not desperation, but devotion, the kind that stays. She reached past him and turned off the record player. The silence that followed was not cold, it was warm, steady. She placed a slice of mango in his hand. Eat, she said softly. You look like a man who hasn't had something sweet in a long time. He took it without a word. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the old house, two people sat at a kitchen table by candlelight, surrounded by thunder silence and everything they never said. Akanoyo. Morning arrived not with trumpets or sunlight, but with the soft rhythm of rain trailing along the roof's edges, gentle like fingers drumming on skin. Naomi lay in bed still wrapped in a blanket of half-dreams, half-truths. Through the slatted shutters, golden light filtered across the wooden floor, painting long slanted lines that seemed to stretch across time itself. Zion was already awake, babbling to himself in his crib by the window. Naomi watched him for a moment before rising, letting her bare feet touch the cool floorboards. Her muscles ached with a kind of tiredness that wasn't entirely physical. It was the weight of returning, of remembering, of holding together the past and present while standing at the edge of something unknown. In the kitchen, the smell of roasted breadfruit and fried plantains greeted her, a scent so rooted in her childhood, it made her throat tighten. But it wasn't Aunt Essie behind the stove. It was Ethan. Wearing one of her late grandfather's old shirts, loose on his frame sleeves, rolled past his elbows, he moved around the kitchen like someone trying not to disturb a prayer. Zion was perched on the counter beside him, giggling as Ethan mashed banana into a small bowl. Careful, Naomi said, stepping into the room. That one's a food critic. Ethan turned at the sound of her voice, and his face lit up in the way only certain people's presence can cause. Good morning, he said, warm and effortless. Good morning, she echoed, slower, testing the words on her tongue. Zion held out a banana-smeared hand. Naomi scooped him up, pressing her lips to his cheek. He smelled like ripe fruit and soap. The kind of smell only children carry, honest, wild, unrepeatable. I hope it's okay, Ethan said, gesturing toward the stove. Aunt Essie told me to let her sleep in. Said her bones weren't made for 5 a.m. anymore. Naomi nodded. She says that every year. Then she's out pulling weeds by 6. They both smiled. She moved to the tea kettle, poured 2 cups of bush tea, and handed one to him. Their fingers brushed, and for a moment, the clink of the spoon, the hum of the wind outside, everything stilled. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For feeding him, for being here. Ethan looked at her, and his eyes held something she wasn't ready to name. Something quiet but powerful, like roots growing under the surface. I like mornings, he said. They feel honest, like the world hasn't lied to you yet. Naomi laughed under her breath. Marcus used to say that. Ethan's expression softened, a flicker of grief crossing his features. Not jealousy, but reverence. You talk about him often, he said. I need to, she replied. For Zion. So he knows love doesn't disappear just because a person does. Ethan nodded. That's beautiful. She turned eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. Is it strange for you? What arraignment? Hearing his name in this house, in my voice. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was with the gravity of someone who had learned that love has many forms and none of them cancel the others out. It's not strange, Ethan said. It's humbling. She looked at him, then a long, searching gaze. There's room in your voice, he added, for more than one kind of love. Her breath caught, not because the words were perfectly said, but because they were offered without expectation. That night in the kitchen had not led to grand declarations or dramatic kisses. It had simply been two people sitting across from one another, peeling mangoes and laying down their pride like clothes at the foot of a bed they didn't yet share. Later that day, they walked together to the edge of the bay. Zion rode on Ethan's shoulders, shrieking every time a crab scurried across the rocks. The tide lapped gently at the sand, the horizon flat and endless. Naomi's skirt fluttered in the wind, her curls wild and free. They didn't speak much. The wind spoke for them. So did the silence. Naomi bent to pick up a shell, pale pink, and spiraled like a dancer frozen mid-turn. When I was little, she said, I used to believe that if you held the right shell to your ear, you could hear someone you lost. Ethan knelt beside her. And who did you want to hear? My mother, Naomi, replied. She died giving birth to me. I used to sit on this beach for hours listening to shells, waiting to hear her say my name. Ethan didn't try to fix the ache in her words. He simply took the shell from her hand, held it to his own ear. She says she's proud, he whispered. Naomi's smiled eyes wet with something ancient and unsaid. They walked the shoreline until the sun dipped low. Zion's arms draped lazily around Ethan's neck, his cheek resting on his shoulder in the way children trust completely. Naomi watched them, these two pieces of her world that had never belonged together until now, and wondered if this moment was a dream or the beginning of a new chapter. That evening, after Zion was bathed and tucked into bed, Naomi stood on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. Ethan joined her, carrying a bowl of fresh guava slices. I fixed the hinges on the back door, he said. I noticed, she replied. No more creaking. I miss the creak already, he said, sitting beside her. Why? It reminded me that some things stay, even after everything changes. They sat in silence, the sound of night insects filling the space between them. Naomi turned to him. When you say my name now, she said, it sounds like you mean it again. I do, Ethan replied, more than ever. And in that fragile stillness, something passed between them, not a promise, not yet, but the beginning of one. A knowing that his name belonged in her house now, that his voice had found its way back not just to her door, but into her days, her son's laughter, her memory. That maybe, just maybe, it could find its way into her heart again. The sky that evening was a dusky lavender kissed with the last warmth of the sun. Down by the village bay, the water had turned mirror smooth, reflecting the colors above like a still dream. Naomi stood barefoot on the sand, holding a paper lantern in her hand. Zion clung to the hem of her dress, his tiny feet making crescents in the wet earth. Tonight was the Lantern Festival, an old island tradition held every year at the beginning of the rainy season, a time to honor the departed, whisper wishes to the sea, and set them afloat in light. It was the first year Naomi had returned since Marcus's passing. Aunt Essie stood nearby, tying ribbons onto lanterns with other women from the village. Their soft chatter and laughter filled the air like music made of memory. Ethan arrived late, his figure moving against the dusk like a quiet shadow. He didn't try to join her immediately. He waited a few paces back, as if uncertain whether this moment belonged to her alone. Naomi turned, meeting his gaze. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. You came, she said softly. I wasn't sure I should, Ethan replied. Didn't want to intrude. She looked down at the lantern in her hand, tracing its edges with her fingers. I made one for Marcus, she said, and one for my mother, and one for the life I thought I'd have, but didn't. Ethan nodded. And for yourself, he asked gently. Naomi hesitated. No, she whispered, not yet. He stepped forward, then careful, like approaching a bird that might fly away. Maybe I can help you make one. She looked at him for a long moment, then handed him a blank lantern. Together, they knelt in the sand beside Zion, who was now sitting with a stick drawing swirls into the shoreline. Naomi lit a small candle and set it inside a new lantern, her hands steady, her breath even. Ethan picked up a piece of charcoal and began to write on the lantern's side. Naomi watched his hand move the curve of his letters, slow and reverent. When he was done, he handed it to her. On it were just 3 words: forgive the silence. Naomi's heart twisted. She traced the words, her fingers smudging the edges of the charcoal. Then in her own writing, she added beneath it, speak and stay. They didn't say anything more. They didn't need to. Naomi stood holding the lantern carefully. Ethan lifted Zion into his arms, and together they walked toward the water. Villagers were already stepping into the shallows, setting their lanterns adrift like floating prayers. The bay flickered with orange and gold, the night illuminated by hundreds of tiny flames dancing across the tide. Naomi waded in up to her knees. The water was warm, calming, like an embrace. She knelt gently and released the lantern. It drifted forward slow and sure, joining the constellation of flickering lights. She closed her eyes. Goodbye, Marcus. Hello, maybe. Thank you, silence. I'm listening now. When she turned back to shore, Ethan was standing there barefoot, holding Zion on his hip, his other hand dangling at his side. It was open, waiting, not demanding. She took it. That night after Zion was asleep and Aunt Essie had retreated to her room, Naomi and Ethan sat on the porch wrapped in a woven blanket. The air was heavy with humidity and the scent of night jasmine. Crickets sang their slow, endless song. I've been thinking, Ethan said quietly, his voice deepened by the hour. I've built skyscrapers, smart homes, rooftop gardens on luxury towers, but nothing I've built has felt like that lantern. Naomi tilted her head toward him. Because it was honest. He nodded. Because it was yours, ours, real. Naomi sighed, leaning back. You always did dream in architecture metaphors. He smiled. I used to think the height of a building mattered most. But now, I think it's the foundation, the quiet unseen part, the part no one applauds but everything depends on. She was quiet for a long while. Then, I don't know what I want, Ethan, she confessed. I don't know if I want to rebuild something that broke before it even had walls. He didn't flinch, didn't press. I don't want what we had, he said slowly. I want what we could become, with space, with truth, with Zion laughing between us and time not against us. Naomi turned to him. And if I fall again, I'll catch you, he said, or I'll fall beside you, but I won't disappear. She studied his face, the one that had changed so much, and yet still held the lines of the boy she once loved. I'm not asking for promises, she whispered. Good, he said, because I'd rather offer presence. The wind rose, lifting her curls from her shoulders. Somewhere beyond the trees, a lantern still floated in the bay, its small light blinking against the tide. And in the stillness of the porch, two people sat, not as lovers returned or strangers reunited, but as something more fragile and more real. Two souls who had learned the cost of silence, who had walked through the fire of absence, and who now, with gentle hands and braver hearts, began to write a new blueprint, not for what was lost, but for what might still rise. Tiarn. The next morning brought with it a haze of golden mist and the low hum of cicadas waking with the dawn. Naomi stood on the edge of the property, barefoot in the dew-drenched grass, gazing at the skeletal frame of a house she had once imagined full of laughter music and late-night lullabies. It stood on a slope above the garden, unfinished, quiet, and patient. Marcus had begun building it just 6 months before his diagnosis. He had drawn the plans himself, carved beams by hand with a neighbor's help, and poured the foundation on a Tuesday morning while Naomi held Zion in her arms and whispered to her son, "This is where you'll grow up." But the house had never been completed. The illness came quickly. Marcus's body began to betray him in ways they couldn't explain. Naomi, already back at work at the rural clinic, traded night shifts for hospital rooms, lullabies for quiet prayers in sterile corridors. By the time they received the final diagnosis, it was already too late. After his funeral, she couldn't bring herself to visit the site. Not until now. The frame had weathered 2 wet seasons. Vines had begun to curl through the windowless spaces. The roof, only half built, let sunlight fall in strips onto the wooden floorboards below. And yet, the bones of it remained strong. Behind her, she heard Ethan's footsteps approach, slow, respectful. You finally came up here, he said gently. Naomi nodded. It's time. She didn't look at him as she walked forward, running her hand along the grain of a support beam. I watched him sketch this house late into the night, she said. He wanted an open kitchen, wide windows, a reading nook under the stairs. He was building a life for us, a sanctuary. Ethan stepped beside her, looking out through the unfinished frame to where the ocean sparkled beyond the trees. It's beautiful, he murmured. Even now. It was never finished, she whispered. That doesn't mean it can't still become something, he replied. Naomi turned to him, her voice low and steady. It's not about rebuilding it, Ethan. It's about whether I can live with what it represents. Ethan met her gaze. What does it represent now? She swallowed hard. Loss, unspoken goodbyes, love that came and left before it could finish making a home. He nodded silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather notebook worn dog-eared filled with sketches and notes in Ethan's familiar looping hand. "I've been working on something," he said, offering it to her. "It's not a plan, not yet. Just ideas." Naomi hesitated, then opened the book. Page after page revealed gentle renderings of a modest house, not grand or showy, but intimate. A porch that faced the sunrise, an herb garden tucked beside a side door, solar panels discreetly woven into a sloping roof, a small room with light pouring in from every direction, clearly a space made for play, for stories, for Zion. But what caught Naomi's breath wasn't the architecture. It was the first page, scrawled in pencil in Ethan's unmistakable print. Built from memory, built for tomorrow. She closed the notebook slowly. "You think we could live here?" she asked. "I think," Ethan said carefully, "that home isn't where we bury our past. It's where we plant it and let it grow into something that nourishes us." Naomi sat on the edge of the platform, her legs dangling over the slope. The breeze lifted her hair, and she tilted her face toward it, eyes closed. "You talk like you've already imagined a life here." "I haven't let myself want anything this real in a long time," Ethan admitted, "but I do now." She opened her eyes. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "So am I," he said, "but I'm more afraid of not trying." They sat in silence for a while, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing and everything in the quiet between them. And then Zion's laughter echoed up the hill. He came running from the garden, hands full of hibiscus petals, his cheeks flushed with joy. Naomi stood gathering him into her arms as he launched himself into her embrace. "Look, Mama, flowers for the house." She kissed the top of his head. Ethan bent down and picked up a fallen nail, tucking it behind his ear like an offering. "Let's keep building," he said softly. Naomi looked once more at the unfinished house, and for the first time since Marcus died, she didn't see loss. She saw possibility. Not a replacement, not a forgetting, but a continuation, a story still being written. And in that moment, standing between what was and what could be, Naomi made a quiet choice, not with grand words or declarations, but with a nod, a breath, a heart cracked open, just wide enough to let hope back in. The house might never be what it was meant to be, but maybe it could become what they all needed now. Ha ha ha, Sumender. The days began to fold into each other with a rhythm Naomi hadn't known. She missed slow mornings, with bush tea and Zion's bare feet pattering across the kitchen tiles. Afternoons in the garden, where Ethan hammered new frames or repaired crumbling stone with the kind of care she once thought extinct in men. And evenings when the sky burned pink and orange, and they'd sit on the veranda without needing to speak. But no island, no matter how beautiful, is untouched by storms. And some storms don't arrive in the sky. They rise from within. It began on a Thursday, quiet and unassuming. Naomi had returned from the clinic in town where she'd helped deliver a breech baby in the back of a pickup truck. The adrenaline still clung to her skin, the pulse of urgency still ringing in her hands. She entered the house expecting warmth, the smell of sautéed onions, or laughter drifting from the living room. Instead, she found silence. Zion was asleep in Aunt Essie's arms, but Ethan was nowhere to be seen. She found him up by the half-built house, standing with his back to her fists, clenched a phone buzzing quietly in his hand. She knew that stance. It was the posture of a man trying not to break. "Ethan," she called gently. He turned startled. His face was unreadable, too blank to be empty. Naomi stepped closer, and he didn't move. "What happened?" He hesitated, then held out the phone. On the screen was a paused video, a news segment. Naomi pressed play. It was footage of one of Ethan's former business partners, well-dressed, confident, speaking to reporters in Manhattan. Words scrolled across the screen. "Walker Developments faces federal investigation over unethical overseas contracts." Naomi blinked. "I thought you walked away from all of that." "I did," Ethan said, 3 years ago, when I realized I hated who I was becoming." She studied his face. "But you never told me why you really left." He exhaled sharply. "I left before the worst of it broke. I saw where it was going. I tried to stop it. They didn't listen. So I resigned. I donated my shares. I walked. But now they're dragging you back into it." He nodded. "My name is still on too many documents." Even if I never touch those contracts, I'm part of the narrative. Naomi crossed her arms, anger rising not at him, but at the world that kept demanding more from those who tried to change. So what does this mean? It means I might be called back. For questioning, for testimony, for everything I left behind. She was silent. The sea murmured in the distance, the wind tugged at the hem of her skirt. I should have told you, he said quietly. I didn't want to lose this. You? Naomi turned away. I don't care about some scandal in New York, Ethan. I care that you didn't trust me with the truth. I was afraid, he said, that if you knew the mess I came from, you'd shut the door before I ever got to knock. She laughed bitterly. You think I haven't lived with mess? I've had a baby alone, buried my husband before I could say goodbye, lived in a house filled with his memories. I know mess, Ethan, but I don't run from it. He stepped forward, the weight of his confession hanging between them. I never meant to lie, but you did. And that was the cut. Not deep, but precise. He bowed his head. I'll go if that's what you want. Naomi looked at him, her voice a whisper now. What I want is for someone to stay, through the storms, without hiding. That night the rain finally came. Hard, relentless cleansing. Naomi sat by the window watching droplets race down the glass like tiny truths chasing one another. Zion slept soundly. Aunt Essie sang hymns from the back room, the words slipping through the floorboards like balm. She didn't know whether to let Ethan back in. He wasn't Marcus. He wasn't perfect. He was complicated, flawed, but he had returned. And that meant something. She found him outside under the awning, soaked to the skin again, just like the day he brought mangoes. You're going to catch a cold, she said softly. He didn't look up. Maybe I deserve it. Don't be dramatic, she said, sitting beside him, the rain splashing at their feet. I should have told you everything the day I arrived. Yes, she agreed. I was ashamed of who I used to be, of what I allowed. Naomi turned to him, her gaze calm. And who are you now? Ethan looked at her, then really looked. Rainwater dripping from his lashes, his mouth parted in some quiet, unanswered plea. I'm a man trying to be worthy of something I once walked away from. She didn't speak. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small seashell. I found this today, he said. Same kind you said you used to listen to. She took it, turning it over in her palm. It was cracked imperfect, but still capable of song. She held it to her ear. The ocean whispered. But beneath that, she heard something deeper. The sound of a man willing to stand in the rain, waiting to be let back in. Naomi lowered the shell, met his gaze, and said only this. Next time, let me listen from the beginning. Ethan nodded, the rain still falling, the truth finally spoken. And though they didn't embrace, didn't kiss, didn't vow, the silence between them had shifted. From wound to window. The sun returned slowly, as if unsure it was welcome after the storm. Pale light spread across the hilltops, casting gentle warmth onto the village below. Leaves glistened with dew. The sea calmed. Birds began their slow, tentative songs again. Naomi stood barefoot in the garden, digging her fingers into the damp soil. It clung to her skin, earthy, fragrant grounding. She'd planted okra here when she was 17. That was before med school, before Marcus, before loss became part of her vocabulary. The garden had been overgrown for years, but now new shoots had begun to rise like small rebellions against grief. Ethan stepped outside carrying a mug of tea in each hand. He didn't speak at first, only placed the mug beside her and knelt in the dirt, sleeves, rolled hands ready. They worked side by side, wordless. This, too, was a kind of intimacy. Naomi glanced over at him, catching the way his brow furrowed as he carefully staked a tomato vine. He wasn't performing. He wasn't rescuing. He was simply present. Do you remember what I used to call you? She asked suddenly. He looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. Which name? There were several. Brickhead, she said, trying not to laugh. He winced. Ouch! You earned it, she said. So stubborn. Always building, always planning. But your heart lagged behind your blueprints. He nodded, the smile fading into something more reflective. I thought purpose came from progress. It took losing everything to realize it actually comes from presence. She leaned back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow. You talk like a monk now. No, Ethan said softly. Just a man who finally heard the silence. Naomi's eyes drifted toward the half-built house on the slope. It still stood solemn and steady, waiting for its second chance. "You could have told me," she said, "about the investigation, about your past." "I know. I still don't know if I trust you fully." "I don't expect you to," he replied. "Trust doesn't come back like a switch. It returns like rain after drought, quiet, intermittent, but eventually it soaks everything." Naomi looked at him long and full. "You always knew how to say things that made sense. You just never stayed long enough to prove them." A pause. "I want to stay," Ethan said. "Not for redemption, not for pity, but because being near you, being near Zion feels like home. Like the kind I never knew I wanted." She turned away, overwhelmed by the pull in her chest. The ache that said maybe. The ache that said not yet, but soon. Later that afternoon, Zion toddled toward the path leading to the edge of the forest, chasing a butterfly, with both delight and fierce determination. Naomi and Ethan followed at a distance, laughing at his squeals and wild arms. They reached the grove where old mango trees arched like cathedral beams overhead, and Naomi slowed. "This was where Marcus proposed," she said. Ethan stopped beside her, reverent. "He brought me here at dawn. We sat on that old rock and watched the sun climb out of the sea. He had no ring, just a handful of sea glass and a promise that we'd never run from hard things." Ethan listened, his chest rising and falling with something like grief but not jealousy. "I'm glad he loved you like that," he said. Naomi's eyes glistened. "I didn't think I'd love again. Not like that." He didn't speak. She turned toward him, the air thick with humidity and unsaid things. "But maybe it doesn't have to be like that. Maybe it can be something else." Ethan stepped closer, something quieter, steadier, born from what we've survived. Their hands touched. Not a kiss. Not yet. But the kind of touch that says we are both still here. That night, the community gathered for a storytelling circle in the village square. Children sat cross-legged, their eyes wide with wonder. Elders wrapped in shawls passed around roasted bread fruit and spiced tamarind tea. Naomi sat beside Ethan on a low bench, Zion nestled between them, half asleep against his shoulder. The storyteller, an old man with a voice like gravel soaked in honey, told a tale about a woman who fell in love with a stonecutter. Every day he carved her name into mountains, hoping to leave proof of his love. But it wasn't until he put down his chisel and took her hand that she believed him. Naomi's eyes stayed on the fire. Ethan watched her not with urgency, but with patience. After the story ended and the flames dimmed, Naomi stood and extended her hand. "Come," she said softly. They walked back together through the dark paths under starlit skies. When they reached the porch, she turned to him. "You don't have to sleep in the shed anymore," she said. He blinked. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "But you're still sleeping in the guest room." He smiled. "That's fair." And as they climbed the steps together, the air thick with night-blooming jasmine and the hush of nearby waves, it became clear. Forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was 1,000 quiet choices. And Naomi had just made another one. Not because the past was erased, but because her heart remembered the sound of staying. The day began with hammering sharp, rhythmic, confident. Naomi awoke to the sound echoing from the hill above the garden, mingling with bird song and the laughter of neighbors. The scent of sawdust and sweetbread drifted on the morning breeze. She pulled the curtains back and saw them, half a dozen villagemen, tools in hand, walking up toward the unfinished house like it was a sacred duty. Ethan stood in the middle of it all, shirt damp with sweat arms glinting in the light, shouting instructions over the hum of effort. The roof was going up. Aunt Essie appeared beside Naomi at the window, holding a cup of lemon balm tea, and her usual look of knowing far more than she let on. "He didn't ask for help," she said. "But the island watches when someone's trying to do something right." Naomi wrapped her arms around herself. "He's not trying to prove anything." "No," Aunt Essie said, sipping. "He's trying to belong." By midday, the frame of the roof had taken shape. Naomi brought jugs of cold tamarind water and a basket of roasted corn to the site. Children ran between scaffolds, barefoot and joyful. Women braided palm fronds to provide temporary shade. It was more than construction, it was communion. A raising of something deeper than wood and nails. Ethan spotted Naomi from across the platform and offered a soft, crooked smile. She walked toward him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Is this how you imagined it?" she asked. "Not exactly," he said. I always thought building a home meant silent solitude. I didn't expect laughter or hands reaching in from every side. That's because before she said handing him a piece of corn, you were building things only for yourself. He took a bite, the salt and spice catching in his throat. And now Naomi said gently, "You're building something for us, even if you haven't said it aloud." Their eyes met unflinching. He opened his mouth to respond, but Zion's shriek cut through the heat. "Mama lookin'!" The boy came running up the slope, a wooden slat tied around his chest like wings. Two other children followed, equally adorned, pretending to fly. Naomi knelt laughing. "What are you, little bird?" "No," Zion said seriously. "I'm the roof. I'm going to fly and keep you all dry." Ethan crouched beside them, resting a hand on Zion's back. "You're already doing that, kiddo," he whispered. By late afternoon, the roof was up. The men shared handshakes and jokes. Women offered breadfruit fritters and rum cake. Someone played an old guitar, and for a moment it felt like a festival. Naomi stood in the center of the half-finished house and turned slowly, letting her fingers graze the newly erected beams. Light poured through the open slats like a benediction. This space, once only Marcus's dream, was now evolving. Still haunted, still sacred, but no longer sealed by memory. She could almost see it now, curtains fluttering, the scent of guava jam in the air, Zion tracing drawings on the kitchen walls, Ethan leaning in the doorway, tired from building, but smiling with peace. Her chest tightened. It felt like betrayal. And yet, it also felt like healing. Ethan came to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that their breaths synced. "You don't have to choose," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "This house can hold all of it. Him, me, you, the before, and the after." Naomi closed her eyes. "It's just that, for so long, I only knew how to survive grief. I forgot how to make space for joy without guilt." His voice was low, reverent. "Joy is in the absence of grief. It's what rises when we carry both." She looked up at him and for the first time let herself imagine what it would be like to wake beside him. Not in memory, not in mourning, but in morning. That evening, as the last slant of sun dipped behind the palms, Naomi sat with Zion in the old rocking chair on the porch. He was half asleep, curled in her lap, humming softly. She stroked his hair, her eyes fixed on the hill, where the new roof now stood silhouetted against a purple sky. Ethan joined her, crouching at her side. He didn't say anything, just placed something gently in her hand. A small piece of wood, sanded smooth. Carved into it was a single word: together. Naomi looked at him, the weight of the words sinking deep into her chest. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached for his hand and laid it gently on Zion's back, covering them both. And in that quiet moment beneath a sky half full of stars and half full of possibility, the house on the hill stood taller. Not just because it had a roof, but because it had become something more than wood and nails and second chances. It had become a home. Señorita, the world woke in a hush. The first light of dawn spilled like honey over the hills, brushing the tips of banana trees and the worn footpaths with gold. Sea mist drifted in languid curls, softening every edge, as if the island itself were holding its breath. Naomi stood at the edge of the bluff, overlooking the ocean, her hands clasped in front of her. She wore a simple ivory dress, the cotton worn thin in places, handed down from Aunt Essie's wedding trunk. There were no pearls, no train, no orchestra, just bare feet, a string of sea glass around her neck, and the sound of waves murmuring their endless lullaby. Behind her, the village gathered, quiet, reverent. The ceremony was not announced. It did not need to be. The island knew. Ethan stood beneath the almond tree waiting. He wore linen pants rolled at the ankle, a soft button down the color of cloud. In his hand, he held a small ring, not gold, not silver, but carved from island mahogany and polished smooth by his own hand. Zion fidgeted beside him, holding the ring on a cushion of palm leaf, looking as solemn as a child could pretend to be. A crown of frangipani circled his curls. Aunt Essie, radiant in a violet wrap, stepped forward and began to speak, not from paper, but from memory and from the heart. "Today is not the beginning," she said, voice clear and steady. "It is the continuation of a story written in silence, in grief and hope, and in slow building trust. A story about choosing again, and again, and again. Naomi took a breath and stepped toward Ethan, the grass damp beneath her feet. She looked into his eyes, the eyes of a man who had once left, and who had now built something sacred, not with words but with presence. He reached for her hand. Their fingers met like puzzle pieces long kept apart. "I don't promise perfection," he said softly. "I promise patience. I don't promise ease. I promise effort. I promise to stay when the roof leaks, when the child cries, when the winds rise. I promise to build not walls, but windows." Naomi's voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of love hard-earned. "I promise to speak even when silence is easier. I promise to make room for you, for grief, for joy, for tomorrow. I promise to believe in what we can make even when I'm tired, even when I'm scared." Zion looked between them with wide, shining eyes. Naomi bent to him, cupping his cheeks. "And you," she whispered, "you made me a mother. You taught me to listen again, to open again. You are the bridge that brought me back to my own heart." Zion grinned and nestled into her arms. Ethan slid the wooden ring onto Naomi's finger, the touch reverent. It wasn't polished smooth. He had left a slight curve in the grain, a mark of where his hand had slipped. A reminder that even love well carved bears its human edges. Naomi kissed Zion's forehead. Then she turned to Ethan and lifted his hand, pressing it to her chest. Her heart beat steady beneath his palm. "I don't need a new beginning," she whispered. "I just need this one morning after another with you beside me." Aunt Essie raised her arms. "With these vows spoken with hearts honest and spirits willing, I bless this union. Not as something perfect, but as something sacred." And then the sun rose, fully cutting through the clouds like a hymn. The ocean turned silver. The trees rustled their applause. The villagers sang an old tune, one Naomi hadn't heard since childhood. A love song in Creole, tender and slow, about a fisherman who returned not for treasure, but for the woman who had waited on the shore. The feast was small, but rich roasted plantain cassava bread, rum steeped with hibiscus and cinnamon. Children danced barefoot in the dust. Elders told stories by the fire pit. Zion fell asleep in Naomi's lap, head nestled against her chest. Ethan sat beside her, his hand resting lightly over hers, not possessive, simply present. She leaned into him, eyes drifting over the hilltop where the house now stood. Walls up, roof-sealed windows, open wide. "I thought I had buried my heart with Marcus," she said softly. Ethan didn't respond, only pressed a kiss to her temple. "I didn't know," she continued, "that hearts don't stay buried. They grow wild. They bloom again in new soil." He smiled. "Then let's keep planting." And so they did. Every morning after they tended the garden, the home and the life between them, not with grandeur, not with ease, but with something far stronger. Commitment. To the child who had taught them to love again. To the ghosts who reminded them to hold tenderly. To each other. Not as the people they once were, but as the ones they chose to become. Together. Hurry! The sky was a soft, pale blue that morning, threaded with a hush of wind through mango leaves and the faint rustle of drying laundry on the line. Naomi moved slowly through the house, her house now fully hers again, yet transformed. Each room bore the imprint of something new. A shelf Ethan had carved, a watercolor Zion, painted with his fingers, a single book left open on the armchair, with its spine turned toward the light. She was dusting the bedroom windowsill when she found it a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of Marcus's old journals. It was lighter than she remembered, its corners worn smooth from years of handling. Her breath caught. She hadn't opened this box since the funeral. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Naomi turned the brass clasp and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, all addressed to her, all in Marcus's handwriting. Some yellowed with time, some still crisp. She had never read them. She had not been ready. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the topmost one. It was dated 2 weeks before Marcus passed. "Naomi, if you're reading this, then you already know there's a future I won't get to walk with you. And that thought guts me more than any diagnosis ever could. But if I've learned anything in this slow unraveling, it's that love isn't measured in years. It's measured in moments offered freely in presence and witness. You gave me more than a life, you gave me roots. You gave me Zion. And you must give yourself permission to live beyond me. If love finds you again, don't turn away. Don't shrink from joy out of loyalty to sorrow. I don't need you to keep a shrine. I need you to be whole. Remember, grief is the echo of love, not its grave. With all I was and will never be. Marcus. Naomi held the letter to her chest, eyes flooding, but her body still. The weight of his words didn't crush her. It released her. Later that afternoon, she found Ethan on the porch, sanding the legs of a small table. Zion was napping inside the hush of his breath, echoing softly through the open windows. She sat beside Ethan, her hand resting lightly on his knee. I read one of Marcus's letters, she said quietly. He paused, the sandpaper stilled in his hand. She didn't look at him, just stared ahead at the slope of land that led down to the garden. He told me not to shrink from joy, that I didn't have to wear grief like armor. Ethan set the table leg aside and reached for her hand. He sounds like the kind of man I would have wanted to know. He was, Naomi whispered. He was kind, quiet, solid. And still, Ethan said gently, he knew that your life couldn't stop for his absence. Naomi turned to him, her eyes clear now. I've been carrying guilt like a second skin. Guilt for laughing, for wanting again, for building something new. She touched the wooden ring on her finger. But maybe healing doesn't mean forgetting. Maybe it just means letting light in through the cracks. Ethan's voice was steady. That's all I've ever hoped for. That evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sea in copper and rose, Naomi brought out the rest of Marcus's letters. One by one, she read them on the porch beside Ethan, while Zion colored seashells nearby. Some were tender, full of memories and hope. Others were raw, written in the darkness of knowing his time was ending. But all of them shared one message. Live. Laugh again. Love when love finds you. She folded the last letter slowly, placed it back into the wooden box, and closed the lid. Then without ceremony, she slid the box into a drawer, not to hide it away, but to give it a place among the living. The next day, Naomi returned to the clinic in town. Aunt Essie had taken over her shifts while she rebuilt her home and her heart, but now it was time. The road to the village was still bumpy, the clinic still had peeling paint and a leaky roof, but Naomi felt something different as she stepped inside. A lightness, a rootedness. She greeted the nurses, checked the charts, and sat with a young mother who had walked 3 miles with a feverish child on her hip. Naomi listened. She asked questions. She placed her hand on the girl's shoulder and said, "You're not alone." And she meant it, because she finally understood that love didn't ask her to choose. It asked her to carry, to blend, to rise. That evening, Ethan met her at the path with Zion balanced on his shoulders, grinning. "Dr. Mama," he called out. Naomi laughed, opening her arms. Zion leapt into them without hesitation. Ethan took her bag from her shoulder. "How was it?" "Hard," she said. "Good." They walked home together, the three of them bathed in the glow of sunset, trailing the scent of hibiscus and old songs. And Naomi thought this is what it means to keep going. Not by forgetting, but by weaving the past into the present thread by thread, letter by letter, until it no longer binds you but bears you forward, toward the life still waiting to be lived. The rhythm of life, once fragile and tentative, had found its music again. It was not loud or remarkable, no grand crescendos, no dazzling finales. It was made of soft mornings and steady footsteps, the rustle of laundry on the line, the clatter of dishes, the hum of lullabies floating down the hall. Naomi stirred the pot of fish stew while Zion, barefoot and wild-haired, chased a paper kite across the yard. Ethan crouched beneath the mango tree, hammering a final nail into the small garden bench he'd promised Aunt Essie months ago. The world once upended had righted itself, but not by returning to what it once was, by becoming something entirely new. That evening, as dusk wove lavender shadows across the hill, Naomi sat on the porch steps with her journal open in her lap. She hadn't written in it since the early days after Marcus's passing, when every word was a wound she couldn't stop pressing. Now the pages felt different. Not a graveyard for sorrow, but a cradle for memory. She wrote slowly. Today Zion tied string around the neighbor's chickens and called them his fleet. Aunt Essie nearly fainted. Ethan laughed so hard he cried. I almost did too. The sea was calm this morning, the way it used to be when I was a girl watching the tide roll in as Papa mended nets and Mama sang. That sound, the hush of waves, it feels like breath, again not weight. Ethan planted marigolds along the front path. He says they're the color of second chances. I believe him. She paused, listening to the laughter from inside, the sound of bathwater, splashing, Zion's voice rising in a melody he was likely making up as he went. Then she wrote, I miss Marcus still, not in a way that keeps me from breathing, but in a way that reminds me how much I once loved and how much I still can. She closed the journal and held it to her chest, eyes turned toward the sea. The wind lifted the hem of her dress, soft as a whisper. A gentle voice, almost imagined, said, You're doing just fine. The next morning, Naomi awoke to find Ethan already in the kitchen, hair tousled, shirt, half-buttoned, flipping pancakes with Zion perched on the counter beside him. Mama, Zion cried, Papa, let me mix the batter. Ethan froze for half a second. The word Papa hovered between them, delicate, unplanned, miraculous. Zion didn't seem to notice what he'd said. He resumed singing to his pancake like it was a pet. Naomi met Ethan's gaze. There were no tears, no dramatics, just the smallest, most radiant smile, one that said everything. Ethan slid the pancake onto a plate, cleared his throat, and said, We'll need syrup. Naomi crossed the room, stood beside him, and kissed his shoulder lightly. Top shelf, she murmured. Later that week, the island hosted its annual harvest festival. It was Naomi's first time attending since Marcus's death. She had avoided it before the music, the dancing, the memory of hands she could no longer hold. But this year, Zion begged, and Aunt Essie insisted, and Ethan simply waited, letting her choose. So she chose. The village square was strung with lanterns, hand-painted and glowing like tiny suns. Drums beat low and deep. Women wore skirts of rust and gold. Men played bamboo flutes and balanced fire sticks on their shoulders. Laughter spilled like rainwater. Zion darted between booths, chasing sweets and riddles. Naomi stood near the edges of the crowd, her dress catching the wind. Ethan appeared at her side, offering his hand. Dance, he asked. She hesitated. It's been so long. He nodded. Then let's make it new. And so they danced. Not gracefully, not perfectly, but with a kind of surrender that only comes from having lost and dared to live again. Their bodies remembered nothing, but their hearts remembered everything. Around them the world shimmered. Within them a home pulsed steady and true. When they returned home that night, Zion asleep in Ethan's arms, Naomi paused at the doorway of the new house. The wood glowed silver in the moonlight. The porch held their shoes scattered. The curtains fluttered in welcome. She stepped inside, and for the first time it didn't feel like a future she feared. It felt like a now she had earned. Ethan laid Zion down, then turned to her. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. They undressed slowly like travelers returning from long exile. Naomi touched his face, his chest, the scar near his ribs he never explained. He kissed her gently. No urgency, just awe. They made love not as a cure for loneliness, but as a celebration of presence. Afterward, wrapped in the hush of moonlight and cotton sheets, she lay with her ear against his chest, listening to the rhythm that had once frightened her in its unfamiliarity. Now it was a song she knew by heart. And when she finally closed her eyes, she dreamed not of what had been lost, but of what had been made, here, in the shape of ordinary days. So, the years passed not as chapters do in a book, but as seasons, softly, insistently, with echoes and roots. In the house on the hill, time left its traces, kindly crayon marks along the kitchen wall, where Zion measured his growing height each year. Ethan's calloused fingerprints embedded in every doorknob he repaired, every cabinet he built. And Naomi's laughter, deeper now, echoing from room to room like sunlight sliding between the leaves. Some days were ordinary, some were extraordinary in their stillness. One early morning, Naomi stepped outside with her tea in hand, wrapped in her favorite shawl, the hem frayed from years of use. The garden bloomed wildly, hibiscus thyme, golden marigolds, Ethan still insisted, symbolized second chances. Zion, now taller than her shoulder and lean as a sapling, sat beneath the guava tree sketching. His face was calm, thoughtful, his father's stillness and his mother's quiet fire sewn into every glance. Naomi walked over, pressing a kiss to the crown of his head. What are you drawing today? He held it up, a house surrounded by gardens and trees. In front of it, a woman with arms outstretched, a man kneeling in the dirt, a child running with a paper kite. 3 hearts drawn in red crayon floated above them, pulsing like lanterns. Naomi touched the page gently. Is that us? Zion nodded. It always is. She sat beside him, letting the morning wrap around them. The sky was clear, the kind of clear that came after a rainstorm, the kind that reminded her what it meant to endure to bloom again. Ethan emerged from the house still in his robe, holding a plate of sliced mangoes and 3 forks. He kissed Naomi's cheek and set the plate between them. "You two planning to stay out here forever?" Naomi smiled. "If the breeze stays like this, maybe." They ate in silence, watching as the light spilled slowly across the land, turning everything gold. That evening, Naomi pulled a bundle of old journals from the back of a closet. Her own handwriting shaky at first, then stronger. Pages filled with grief, wonder, small observations. Zion's first laugh after Marcus passed away. Ethan's hands trembled when he first held a hammer again, the day she realized she could love without betraying the past. She lit a candle and read aloud to Ethan on the porch. He sat beside her, listening as though her words were music. "And I have learned," she read, "that healing is not forgetting. It is remembering without the wound breaking open. It is holding space for what was while welcoming what is." Ethan took her hand, entwining their fingers. "Read that part again," he said. She did. And then she closed the journal and let her head rest on his shoulder. "You made this life with me," she whispered. "No," he said. "We remade it, together." They sat there until the moon rose round and full, spilling silver across the porch. And when Naomi finally spoke again, it was with the quiet strength of someone who had lived fully, loved deeply, and returned from the brink not just whole, but radiant. "I used to think the great love of my life had already been written," she said. "But I was wrong." Ethan turned to her, waiting. She smiled. "The great love of my life is still unfolding." The next morning, a new wind swept over the island, rustling the banana trees and sending the scent of sea salt into every window. Naomi stood in the garden, watching Zion run with his newest invention, 2 kites tied together, dancing like twin wings. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What do you see?" he asked. She leaned into him. "The future," she said, "and I'm not afraid of it anymore." They watched as the boy raced toward the sky, and the kites soared higher than they'd ever dared before. Dear listener, if you've walked this journey with Naomi and Ethan through grief and grace, through silence and song, thank you. This story is not just theirs. It belongs to all of us who have loved, lost, and chosen to love again. If their story moved you, if you found a piece of yourself in their struggle, in their laughter, in the quiet rebuilding of something broken, then I invite you to keep walking with us. Share your thoughts below, your favorite moment, a line that stayed with you, or your own story of healing. Like this video if it touched your heart. And don't forget to follow this channel where stories of hope, renewal, and the strength of everyday love continue to unfold. Because sometimes the greatest stories are not the ones with dragons or diamonds, but the ones where 2 people choose again and again to stay.